2 hours before sunrise, a small brick cabin burned hot enough to sting the air. No storm, no lightning, just a fire that refused to die. By daylight, a man was missing. By noon, whispers turned to fear. By nightfall, fear had a name: Celia, a 19-year-old enslaved girl who had been forced to survive in that cabin for years. Neighbors searched creek beds and fence lines. They checked the orchard, the smokehouse, the wells. They followed footprints that faded into dew. But the truth was not in the fields. It was in the hearth. Ashes sifted fine, bone turned to pale dust, and a silence that rang louder than church bells. This is Missouri, 1855. A county full of rules that protect power and punish the powerless. A courtroom that says a victim cannot speak. A law that calls a woman property, then calls her a murderer when she fights back. Tonight, we follow the papers, the testimonies, and the road that leads to a gallows at 2:30 p.m. We will see what the record tried to hide, how a young woman, after years of abuse, took one step across an invisible line and never came back. Before we begin, subscribe and comment your state below. Tell us where you're watching from. Because this story isn't just history, it's a mirror. If a door keeps you in, who does it keep out? Missouri in the mid-1850s was a borderland with a split heart. The map said United States, but the roads told a different truth. Wagons rolled in from Virginia and Kentucky, bringing families, tools, and a system that thrived on control. Callaway County sat in the middle of it. River air, rich soil, and a fear that traveled faster than the mail. The law was clear on paper and cruel in practice. White men held property. Black people were counted as it. Sheriffs knew the owners by name. Judges knew what not to hear. If an enslaved person was beaten, starved, assaulted, or taken in the night, the record stayed quiet. But if a white man went missing, the entire county found its voice. Across the western border, Kansas bled. Popular sovereignty, they called it. Let the people decide slavery for themselves. But the choice came with gunpowder and sermons. Pro-slavery riders and free state militias traded threats and bullets. In Callaway, folks read those headlines the way farmers watch the sky. A storm is coming. Keep the fence tight. Keep the house in order. Order meant patrols after dark. It meant bells that called field hands at sunup and locked doors at sundown. It meant 100 little rules shaping a single lesson. Do not resist. Men with ledgers and keys believed fear could manage everything. Labor, love, even thought. They did not imagine fear could also kindle resolve. In this world, silence lived in plain sight. A girl could be bought at 14 and placed in a separate brick cabin for kitchen work, and everyone would understand the lie without saying it. Daughters who kept the parlor tidy also kept their eyes down. Neighbors heard what they pretended not to hear. A night walk from the main house to the little house under fruit trees was not a secret. It was a schedule. So when Robert Newsom, an older man with land, cattle, and a reputation for getting what he wanted, vanished, the county felt the ground shift. Not because a life was sacred, but because property had dared to fight property. The question ricocheted down the lanes. If order breaks in that cabin, where else can it break? The politics of the moment poured gasoline on the smallest spark. Newspapers argued over states' rights and federal lines, while families argued over supper. Kansas, Washington, justice, judgment. Ministers preached obedience from pulpits packed with men who built their wealth on forced obedience. And yet, beneath the hymns and harvests, a simple truth kept pressing on the ribs of the county. There is a limit to what one person can endure. Dates anchor memory, so let's mark them. June 23, 1855, a Saturday night. Heat in the air, storm rumors rolling across fields. The orchard still, the cabin lamp flickering. By that date, Celia had already spent years inside a ritual of harm that wore the mask of habit. She was young, black, and enslaved. He was white, older, and called master. The routine had no surprises until it did. In places like Callaway, people like to say, the law is the law. But laws do not feel nausea. Laws do not wake to footsteps. Laws do not raise children who hear what no child should hear. When the law refused to protect Celia, the county taught her something else. If safety will not come to you, sometimes you go to it. This is the air we breathe as we step toward the cabin. A county anxious to keep the lid on, a nation splitting at the seam, a house that knows its own secrets, and a girl who finds the edge of her fear and decides to stand on it. Callaway County, Missouri, 1855. Kansas violence nearby. Laws serve owners. A missing man threatens order. A young black woman's limit has been reached. Do you think history remembers the truth or just the winners? Every tragedy has a villain, and in Callaway County, his name was Robert Newsom. To his neighbors, he was a farmer with 800 acres, a man who knew livestock, a man who had daughters and a grandson. To Celia, he was something else entirely, a shadow that entered her room at night, a weight she could never push away, a voice that turned her body into property. Robert's story didn't start in Missouri. He came from Virginia around 1822, part of that wave of families who crossed the Mississippi, looking for cheap land and a fresh start. What he found was opportunity, a slave state where the rules worked in his favor. Missouri's compromise with Congress allowed him to plant corn and wheat with one hand and tighten chains with the other. By the 1850s, his farm stretched wide, fields, cattle, pigs, orchards, and its value was measured not just in dollars but in human beings. He had 5 enslaved men and 1 boy. What he didn't have was women. Not until 1850. That choice wasn't an accident. Robert's appetite was calculated. He wanted control without interference, obedience without questions, and a girl young enough to bend to his desires. That summer, he made a trip 40 miles to Drain County. The official reason? To find a cook. The real reason? To buy what the law would not call by its true name. He returned with a girl named Celia. She was only 14. The journey back was long enough for Robert to show her what ownership meant. On the road itself, before she even reached his farm, he committed his first act of violence against her. A pattern began that would repeat for 5 years, each night a reminder that there was no escape. She wasn't a servant in his household. She was his possession, and he built her a cabin to prove it. From a distance, the brick cabin looked almost generous, separate from the quarters, tucked beneath fruit trees, neat in its construction. But neighbors knew what it really was, a private cell. 50 yards from the main house meant Robert could walk there in the dark, unseen but not unknown. Everyone understood. His daughters, Virginia and Mary, lived with the truth without speaking it. Other enslaved workers avoided the topic like a field snake. Acknowledging it meant punishment or sale. Elizabeth, Robert's wife, had died 6 years earlier. People whispered she was the last shield between Robert and his most sordid impulses. With her gone, there was nothing to restrain him. His daughters ran the domestic chores. He claimed the nights. The county pretended not to see. What does power look like when it has no limits? It looks like a 60-year-old man walking through an orchard under moonlight, not afraid of discovery, because discovery carried no consequences. Looks like a girl with no family nearby, locked in silence because the law itself said her testimony had no value. In Missouri, raping an enslaved woman wasn't a crime. It was using property. That was Robert's shield. Within 2 years, Celia bore children. Their skin tone, their features, left no doubt who the father was. She had no choice in the matter, no recognition, no protection. Her children were born into bondage, their first breath already belonging to the man who had forced them into existence. And still, the visits continued. By 1855, the farm was worth over $3,500, a fortune then. Neighbors measured Robert's wealth with respect, not shame. They saw cattle, not cruelty. They saw land, not loneliness. But every acre was stained with what happened in that cabin. Every fence post leaned on the silence of people who chose not to intervene. Robert Newsom wasn't just a man with land. He was the embodiment of a system, absolute power without conscience. And like every system built on fear, he believed it would hold forever. Callaway County, 1850. Robert Newsom buys a 14-year-old girl, builds her a cabin. Abuse becomes ritual. By 1855, she has his children. Silence protects him. Would you have dared to speak if you lived on that farm? For 5 long years, the brick cabin stood as Celia's cage. On the outside, fruit trees swayed gently with each season. Inside, silence carried a different weight. It was the silence of fear, the silence of children waking to footsteps they already recognized, the silence of other slaves turning their eyes away, because their own survival depended on not noticing. Celia's life was divided between two worlds: daylight service and midnight violation. By day, she cooked, cleaned, and kept the kitchen fires steady for Robert's family. By night, she endured. 2 children were born into that cycle, one when she was barely 16, another at 18. Both carried the same unmistakable features. Both were reminders that her body was never her own. Neighbors could see those children. Robert's daughters could see them too. Virginia, the elder, managed the household with a strict hand. Mary, younger, was still learning womanhood under her father's roof. Both knew, both stayed silent. Some said it was fear, others said shame. But whatever the reason, their silence was a wall that kept Celia trapped. Robert enforced that wall with precision. He kept her separate from the other enslaved workers. He told them, and her, that interference meant punishment or sale. To a slave, sale wasn't just a transaction. It was exile, meant being torn from children, from familiar fields, from the tiny roots you'd grown in barren soil. So no one came close to Celia's cabin. No one risked their own chains to loosen hers. Yet even in that cage, a spark of humanity survived. His name was George. Young, strong, and enslaved like her, George noticed. He had watched Robert's pattern, had seen Celia's children, had known the unspoken truth. In whispers, in stolen moments, he reached for her. Their meetings were dangerous, but they were also her first taste of choice. With George, for the first time since she was 14, she was not property. She was a woman. She was wanted. Their secret was fragile, but it was also radical. Every time George crossed the orchard at night to sit with Celia, it was defiance. Every laugh they shared was rebellion. For a woman buried under years of forced submission, that affection meant life. And yet even love carried weight. George couldn't change the law. He couldn't erase Robert's power. What he could offer was himself. A dangerous promise in a world where promises broke easily. By 1855, the air in Missouri was charged. Kansas burned just across the border. Patrols doubled. Rumors of revolt spread like prairie fire. In Celia's cabin, rebellion took a quieter shape. A woman who was tired of silence and a man who dared to care for her. That combination made the orchard feel different. It felt like something waiting to break. But history isn't kind to love under chains. For Celia, hope carried danger, and the danger was coming faster than she realized. Each visit from Robert grew heavier. Each word from George pressed harder. Her world was closing in, and soon she would face a choice no one should ever have to make: to surrender completely or to fight back knowing the cost would be her life. 1855. Celia bore 2 children in the cabin. Daughters stayed silent. Robert controlled her isolation. George offered secret affection. But love under slavery came with peril. If you had been George, would you have risked everything for her? By the winter of 1855, Celia's fragile hope began to splinter. She was pregnant again. The sickness came first. Waves of nausea that left her weak at the stove, trembling with exhaustion while the Newsom family waited for their meals. Her body was worn from years of labor and abuse. This new pregnancy pressed harder than the others, and with it came a storm of questions she could not escape. Whose child was this? Robert's? Or George's? The answer mattered in ways both intimate and unbearable. If the child was Robert's, it would be another reminder that she had no shield against him. If it was George's, it meant that love had planted life even in a place of cruelty. But either way, the child would be born into chains. George did not take the news well. His affection had been real, his risk genuine, but jealousy gnawed at him. "If you don't stop with the old man," he told her, "I want nothing to do with you." His words were like a lash. He knew as well as she did that stopping was impossible. Still, he gave the ultimatum. Celia was left torn between the man who violated her and the man she loved, neither of whom could protect her. Sick, tired, desperate, she did something almost unthinkable. She appealed to Robert's daughters. Virginia, the elder, had authority in the household. Mary, the younger, had watched the truth unfold in silence. Celia approached them with courage born of despair. She asked them to intercede, to beg their father to leave her alone while she was ill. She wasn't asking for freedom or even for mercy, just a pause. A chance to carry her pregnancy without being forced to endure more nights. What did the daughters say? History leaves us with fragments. Some suggest they whispered to him, perhaps timidly, perhaps briefly. But nothing changed. Robert ignored their voices as he had ignored Celia's. Whatever power his daughters held stopped at the door of his desires. Their silence once again became complicity, so Celia tried one more time, this time directly. She begged Robert himself. She told him she was too sick, that she could not endure. For the first time, she resisted not just with her body, but with words. It was an act of courage, but it was also an act of last resort. Robert's answer was chilling in its simplicity. He would come that night as always. No illness, no pregnancy, no plea could stop him. For Celia, something broke in that moment. Every path had been closed. George's love now came with conditions she could not meet. The daughters had turned away. Her master had made his intentions clear. There was no court to hear her, no law to protect her, no neighbor to defend her. The message was unmistakable. You will endure, or you will pay. But there are limits to endurance. That night, Celia made a decision that separated her from the girl who had been bought at 14. She would not plead again. She would not beg. If Robert came through that door, she would resist. For the first time in her life, she prepared for a confrontation she knew could cost her everything. The cabin that had been her prison would soon become the stage of her rebellion. Early 1855. Celia, pregnant and sick, pleads with Robert's daughters for help. They fail her. George demands the impossible. Robert promises to return that night. She decides to resist. Do you believe vengeance ever brings justice or only more loss? The day was June 23, 1855, a Saturday. The air was heavy, as if the sky itself knew what was about to break. In the orchard, the fruit trees swayed quietly. In the main house, supper was served. And in the little brick cabin by the grove, Celia prepared for war. Not with soldiers, not with rifles, but with a single piece of wood. All afternoon, she thought about it. She had begged. She had asked. She had even dared to resist with words. Nothing had changed. Robert had promised he would come that night. His footsteps would once again cross the orchard. His hand would again push open her door, and she would again have no choice. Unless she made one. She looked around her cabin. 2 children slept on their mats, innocent in the only world they had ever known. Their breathing was steady, soft. They did not know that their mother's mind was sharpening into resolve. She found a stick, about the size of a chair rung, thick enough to break bone, short enough to wield with force. She placed it within reach. Not hidden, not disguised, waiting. It was not a weapon chosen in haste. It was a symbol. A stick against a man, a girl against a system. She knew that one strike could change everything. She also knew the penalty. Slaves who struck their masters were hanged. No exceptions. To raise that stick was to sign her own death warrant. But to do nothing was worse. The hours crept forward. Dusk bled into darkness. The farm quieted. Virginia tucked her son into bed. Mary extinguished the lamps. Even the animals seemed still. But in the cabin, the fire in the hearth burned low, its glow stretching shadows across the walls. Celia sat, waiting, her hand brushing the wood, her body tense, her heart pounding louder than the cicadas outside. Around 9 o'clock, Robert left the main house. Virginia saw him last. Perhaps she wondered. Perhaps she didn't. He walked the same path he had walked for 5 years, across the orchard, under the fruit trees, to the little cabin lit by lamplight. His routine was so practiced, so ordinary, that he never imagined it could end differently. Inside, Celia rose to her feet. She backed toward a corner as she always did, the movements rehearsed by terror. Robert thought it was the usual resistance, the kind that gave him power to strip away. But this time her body carried another kind of weight. She was not preparing to submit. She was preparing to strike. Her children shifted in their sleep, unaware. The orchard swayed. The night held its breath. Celia gripped the stick. She was 19 years old, 3 months pregnant, and standing at the edge of history. Tonight, she would no longer be property. Tonight, she would be something the law refused to imagine. A woman fighting back. What followed would change not only her life, but the story of Missouri itself. Because when Robert stepped into that room, he believed he owned everything he saw. the walls, the children, the girl. But in truth, he owned nothing. Not anymore. June 23rd, 1855. Celia places a wooden stick within reach. She knows striking Robert means death, but silence means worse. She waits. If a door keeps you in, who does it really keep out? The orchard was silent. No dogs barked. No owls stirred. It was past 10 when Robert's boots pressed against the dirt path, carrying him toward the little cabin he had claimed as his own domain. The man was 60, but his stride was steady. Why wouldn't it be? For 5 years he had walked this way without fear. The law had been his shield, silence his accomplice. Tonight he expected nothing different. Inside, Celia's lamp burned low. Her children slept on their mats, the small rise and fall of their breathing the only sound in the room. The stick lay where she had placed it, close enough that her fingers could find it without thought. Her body trembled, not from weakness but from the weight of decision. The door creaked open. Robert entered, the smell of whiskey and sweat preceding him. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence alone was command. He stepped closer, eyes fixed on what he believed belonged to him. Celia retreated to a corner, just as she always had. To him it was ritual. To her it was positioning. When he reached for her, she moved differently. Her hand closed around the stick. In that instant, years of terror compressed into a single act. She raised the wood high, her muscles fueled by sickness, rage, and survival. The first blow landed square on his skull. Crack echoed through the cabin. Wood against bone, louder than the cicadas, louder than the beating of her heart. Robert staggered, groaning, collapsing onto a stool. Blood trickled down his temple, dark against lamplight. He was injured, but not finished. He tried to rise, hands fumbling toward her. The same hands that had claimed her since she was 14. In that moment, Celia saw the future if she faltered. Brutal retaliation. Her children torn from her, sale or death by torture. She could not allow him to stand again. She raised the stick once more. The second strike came with everything she had left. The blow crushed bone, silenced breath, and ended a man who had believed himself untouchable. Robert Newsom, master of land and lives, lay dead on the floor of the cabin he had built as his private prison. For the first time in 5 years, the room was quiet. The silence was not fear. It was release. The only sounds were Celia's ragged breathing and the soft stirrings of her children, who turned in their sleep but did not wake. She stood over his body, gripping the stick, her arms trembling. She had crossed the line. She was no longer a victim. She was a killer. And yet the feeling that filled her chest was not triumph. It was necessity. She had done what the law would never do. Protect her own body. Minutes stretched like hours. She knew the danger. Killing him was only the first step. If she left his body where it fell, morning would bring her noose. If she buried him, neighbors would find the grave. She needed a solution that erased him completely. Her decision was cold, clear, and terrifying. She would turn her fireplace into a furnace. She would reduce him to ashes. Celia wiped sweat from her brow, set the stick aside, and dragged the body toward the hearth. Pregnant, sick, exhausted, but resolute. The night of vengeance was not finished. It had only begun June 23, 1855. Inside the cabin, Celia struck Robert twice. The second blow killed him. For the first time, silence meant freedom, but only if she could hide what she had done. What would you have done in her place? The man was dead, but the danger was not. For Celia, the body on the floor was not just flesh. It was evidence. And in Callaway County, evidence was death. She had hours, maybe less, before someone noticed Robert's absence. Her mind, sharpened by desperation, fixed on one choice. The fire. The cabin hearth was small, built for cooking and warmth. Never meant for what she was about to do. But if she could feed it enough wood, keep it burning long enough, perhaps she could make him vanish. She dragged the corpse, nearly 180 pounds, across the dirt floor. Pregnant, sick, shaking with exhaustion, she pulled with every ounce of strength she had left. Inch by inch, she moved him toward the flames. Sweat stung her eyes. Her arms burned. But at last, Robert's body lay before the hearth. She stacked wood high, building a blaze that roared. Sparks snapped. Heat pressed against her skin until her eyes watered. The smell of burning flesh soon filled the room. Thick, acrid, unforgettable. She forced herself not to gag, not to falter. Her children stirred but did not wake. They would never understand what their mother was doing in the firelight. Hours passed. She fed the flames with staves, kindling, anything that would burn hot and fast. The cabin became an oven. She wiped her face with ash-stained hands and pressed on. Bone began to crack. Fat sizzled. The air grew heavy with smoke and horror. But fire alone could not finish the job. When dawn approached, fragments remained, charred bones that defied the flames. Celia's resolve deepened. She picked them up, one by one, and smashed them against the stones of the hearth. Each crack echoed through the cabin like a grim drumbeat. She ground them down until they splintered into smaller pieces, then tossed them back into the fire. Still, some resisted. She buried those stubborn fragments beneath the fireplace, wedging them into the cracks of the floorboards, hiding them where eyes would not see. She scattered ashes outside, blending them with soil along the orchard path. In a moment of desperate cunning, she even enlisted Robert's own grandson, Coffee, offering him nuts to help her carry buckets of ash to the stables. The boy had no idea he was spreading the pulverized remains of his grandfather across the land. The irony was cruel and chilling. Robert's own bloodline unwittingly scattering him to dust. By the time the sun rose, the man who had ruled her nights was gone. Reduced to smoke, ashes, fragments hidden in earth and hearth. The cabin smelled of death but looked deceptively clean. A fire gone cold, a floor swept, a woman moving through her morning tasks as if nothing had changed. Celia had done the impossible. She had erased a master. Yet she knew erasure was never perfect. Somewhere in the embers, somewhere in the soil, clues remained. She prayed the county would not know where to look. For a brief moment, as the first light crept through the window, silence wrapped around her again. This time it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of completion. For 5 years, Robert had walked into that cabin certain he would leave. On this night he hadn't, but silence cannot last forever. And in Missouri, a missing white man did not stay missing long. Over 6 hours, Celia burned Robert's body, crushed bones, hid fragments, and scattered ashes, even with his grandson's help. By sunrise, he was gone, but traces remained. Do you think history remembers courage or only the crime? At first, Robert's disappearance seemed like an inconvenience, not a crisis. When he failed to return by morning, Virginia assumed he'd wandered too far or taken ill along one of his familiar paths. By noon, unease spread through the household. By evening, neighbors had joined the search. Callaway County, a missing slave master was everyone's problem. They scoured the farm. Creek beds, fences, caves, the orchard. Virginia's mind surely drifted toward the unspoken truth, that her father's footsteps so often ended at Celia's cabin. But she said nothing. Out loud, she framed it as concern for an aging man. Inside, she knew better. Robert's sons, Harry and David, arrived and widened the search. Their presence turned worry into suspicion. They asked sharper questions. They pushed harder. That's when attention shifted to George. Neighbors whispered about his closeness to Celia, about jealousy, about motive. Questioned directly, George denied everything, then made a slip that sealed Celia's fate. He told searchers that Robert's last walk could only have been near the house. He pointed toward the cabin. With those words, suspicion narrowed like a blade. Investigators, led by neighbor William Powell, marched to Celia's door. Inside, they found a tidy room, a swept floor, a neat hearth, no sign of struggle, no trace of blood. To untrained eyes, it was ordinary. To Powell, it was too clean. He confronted Celia in the main house kitchen. She stirred pots with steady hands, her face calm, almost defiant. Powell began with deception. He claimed George had already confessed and told them she knew the truth. It was a common tactic. Pit slaves against each other, break them with lies. Celia denied everything. The interrogation escalated. Powell threatened to take her children, her 2 small ones, the only light in her life. To enslaved mothers, the threat of separation was a fate worse than death. Celia held firm, though her resolve began to crack. Then came the rope. Powell made it clear. Hangman's noose unless she spoke, hours stretched. Threats shifted to promises. Mercy if she confessed, torment if she did not. The pressure was relentless, designed to grind her will into dust. Finally, Celia asked for one condition. Robert's sons must leave the room. She knew their anger would be immediate, their violence uncontrollable. Only then, with Powell and a few others present, did she begin to speak. Her first version was partial. Yes, Robert had visited her cabin. Yes, he had pressed her again, but she claimed he left after she resisted. Powell pressed harder. The story unraveled. At last she admitted the truth. She had struck him twice with a stick. The second blow had killed him, but she insisted she never meant to kill, only to stop him, only to protect herself. That distinction mattered to her. It was the difference between self-defense and murder, between surviving and plotting. But to Powell, to Robert's sons, to the county, it was all the same. A slave had killed her master. Then came the final question. Where is the body? And here Celia's words chilled the room. She described the fire, the hours of burning, the crushing of bones, the scattering of ashes. Powell and the others listened in disbelief. A 19-year-old girl had done what seemed unthinkable, erased a man almost completely. The next search of her cabin proved her story. Beneath the ashes, they found charred bone fragments, a melted buckle, blackened buttons. Enough to confirm, enough to condemn. Celia was taken in chains to Callaway County Jail. Her fate would no longer be decided in whispers or orchards. It would be decided in a courtroom that was never meant to give her justice. Neighbors searched. George slipped. Powell interrogated. Celia confessed. 2 blows, a fire, scattered ashes. Evidence confirmed it. She was jailed. If a law protects oppressors and punishes the oppressed, can it ever be called justice? October 9th, 1855, Fulton, Missouri. The courthouse doors swung open and the community filed in. Farmers, merchants, widows, and landowners crowded the benches. They weren't just here for justice. They were here to watch the order of their world be defended. At the center sat Celia, 19 years old, shackled, her belly once swollen with a child she had lost in jail. She was no longer just a slave girl in a cabin. She was an accused murderer, a danger to the system itself. The judge was William Augustus Hall. He wore the authority of the state, but beneath the robe stood a man invested in preserving the very system on trial. Hall's rulings would make that clear. From the start, he barred any mention of Robert's years of sexual abuse. When defense attorneys tried to argue that Celia had acted in self-defense against rape, Hall shut them down. To him it was irrelevant. To the law of Missouri, a slave woman had no right to refuse her master. The defense team was led by John Jameson, an experienced lawyer, and a slave owner himself. His argument was bold for the time. Missouri law, passed in 1845, stated that any woman had the right to resist sexual violence. Jameson asked, didn't any woman mean all women enslaved or free? If Celia struck Robert to prevent rape, wasn't that the very definition of self-defense? It was a revolutionary claim, one that threatened to crack the foundation of slavery. If the court accepted it, every enslaved woman could claim the same right. The system could not allow that. Hall sustained every objection from the prosecution. He ordered such arguments struck from the record. Celia herself was silenced. Missouri law forbade slaves from testifying against whites. She could not take the stand to explain her terror, her sickness, her desperation. The jury would never hear her voice. Instead, they heard from Robert's daughters. Virginia testified about discovering buttons she herself had sewn on her father's clothing, found charred in the ashes of Celia's hearth. She described the stench, the strange lumps that released a sickening odor when broken apart. Her words painted a picture not of abuse but of horror. Then came young Coffee, Robert's grandson. Innocent, he recounted how he had carried buckets of ash, spreading them along the path. The courtroom gasped, not at the cruelty that forced a child to scatter his grandfather's remains, but at the confirmation that Celia had gone to such lengths to hide her crime. 12 jurors sat in judgment. All white men. Most were farmers, many were slaveholders. Not one was impartial. They weren't deciding Celia's guilt or innocence. They were defending a way of life. For them, the issue was simple. A slave had killed her master. To acquit her would be to admit that slaves had the right to resist. That was unthinkable. On October 10th, after only brief deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Hall sentenced Celia to hang. The date was set for November 16, 1855. As the gavel struck, the courtroom sighed in relief. The order of things had been restored, but outside whispers spread. Some saw the trial as proof that the law bent only for the powerful. Others quietly saw Celia's act as courage, an echo of resistance in a land that called resistance a crime. October 1855. Fulton Courthouse. Judge Hall silenced Celia's defense. The jury of white men convicted her in hours. Sentence, death by hanging. Do you think history remembers the trial or the silence that shaped it? The gavel had fallen, but Celia's story was not finished. Her lawyers, men who owned slaves themselves, filed an appeal. They argued that Judge Hall's rulings had stripped her of any chance at justice, that her act was not murder but self-defense, that Missouri's own law promised protection to any woman, but appeals moved slower than gallows. The date of her execution was already set, November 16, 1855. In Callaway County Jail, Celia waited. She was 19, frail and grieving. Weeks earlier, in her cell, she had delivered a stillborn child. Whether it was Robert's or George's, no one would ever know. The infant never drew breath, and Celia buried her hope with it. The county recorded the death without comment, as though another black child's life had never mattered. Still, she clung to fragments of hope. Her lawyers wrote to the Missouri Supreme Court, urging delay. "We feel more than common interest in favor of the girl Celia," they confessed, acknowledging what the court would not, that she had killed to stop a forced attack. For a brief moment, the system itself hesitated. Then something remarkable happened. On November 11th, just 5 days before her scheduled hanging, Celia escaped. How? The records are murky. Some whispered her lawyers had helped her slip away, buying time for the appeal. Others thought sympathetic townsfolk unlocked her chains. However it happened, the news spread fast. The condemned girl was gone, but freedom lasted only weeks. In December, she was captured and dragged back to jail. Whatever mercy had existed was over. On December 14th, the Missouri Supreme Court rejected her appeal. They declared there was no probable cause to disturb the verdict. The law had spoken, but it had not listened. A new date was set, December 21st, 1855. On the eve of her execution, Celia gave her final words. They were simple, chilling, unforgettable. "As soon as I struck him, the devil entered me, and I struck him with the stick until he died." What did she mean? Some say she was explaining the frenzy of survival, that terror itself had driven her hand. Others hear a deeper truth, that in a system so corrupt, violence felt like possession, like stepping outside humanity into something raw and inescapable. Whatever the meaning, her words echo because they carry both confession and defiance. At 2:30 in the afternoon, December 21st, the rope was prepared. 19 years old, a mother, a girl who had begged for mercy, a girl who had found none. Celia was led to the gallows. We do not know who stood in the crowd. We do not know who watched her fall. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave. No record marks where. Her 2 surviving children became part of Robert's inheritance, divided like livestock between his sons. Their mother hanged, their father burned, their childhood scattered. Celia's story could have ended in silence, erased like so many others, but her words remained. Her act remained. And the record of her trial exposed a truth most in Missouri wanted hidden, that the law was never about justice. It was about power. November-December 1855. Celia gave birth to a stillborn child. She escaped, was recaptured, and executed on December 21st. Her final words, "The devil entered me." Do you think Celia's final words were despair or defiance? The cabin is gone now, the orchard too. Time erased the buildings, but not the questions. What remains is a story passed through court transcripts, yellowed pages, and whispers that never fully died. Celia's act did not topple the slave system. Her death did not end abuse. But for one night in June 1855, she broke a rule older than the nation itself, that enslaved women had no right to resist. Her resistance cost her life, but it carved her name into the dark wood of history. The contradictions of her trial expose a system that was never about justice. When she was a victim, the law called her property. When she resisted, the law called her a person and condemned her for it. The hypocrisy is staggering. She was invisible when she suffered, visible only when she struck back. Robert Newsom was not unique. He was the face of a system that normalized sexual violence as part of ownership. Thousands of enslaved women endured what Celia endured. Most never had their stories told. Most did not fight back because the cost was unbearable. Celia's defiance is remembered precisely because it was rare, and because it was punished so severely. Generations later, descendants of both families live with the legacy. Celia's descendants, when found by researchers, speak of pride. To them, she is not just a killer. She is a survivor who chose dignity over silence. Robert's descendants speak of shame, of a past they would rather bury. Their perspectives reveal how slavery's shadow still divides memory in America. But beyond bloodlines, Celia belongs to all of us who ask what justice means. Was she guilty of murder? The jury said yes. But history asks a harder question. When a woman with no power resists her abuser, is it crime or survival? The ashes scattered across that Missouri farm tell their own story. They say a man who believed himself untouchable was reduced to dust by the courage of someone he thought powerless. They say silence has a breaking point. They say that in the darkest corners of oppression, resistance still flickers like fire in a hearth. Today, historians walk the fields, turn the brittle pages of trial records, and hear her voice between the lines. The devil entered me. A phrase heavy with guilt, with fear, with something deeper, a recognition that in a world built on evil, even acts of violence can be acts of self-preservation. Celia was hanged at 19, but her story still stands almost 170 years later, because it forces us to face the questions we'd rather avoid. What would you have done in her place? Would you have endured? Would you have fought? The law did not protect her. The court did not hear her. But she spoke anyway, not with testimony, but with action. And though she paid the price, her defiance remains a reminder that justice is not always found in verdicts. Sometimes it's found in the courage to resist when the world tells you not to. The path where Coffee spread his grandfather's ashes has long since disappeared into soil and grass. But if you listen closely, the silence there still speaks. It tells of a girl who refused to surrender her body one more time. It tells of fire, of vengeance, of tragedy, and of a dignity reclaimed at the highest cost. Celia's story lingers because it asks us to look in the mirror, and the question is not only about her, it is about us. If Celia's story moved you, share it. Subscribe to Legacy of Fear, so we can keep bringing hidden voices back to light. And in the comments, tell us, do you believe history remembers the truth, or only what power allows to survive?